I watched Night of the Seven Kingdoms already, and I thought it was one of the best seasons of television that I've seen from any of the Game of Thrones shows that HBO has produced. Although not perfect, there are a few issues. I loved it. Let me tell you why. So a little background here. In the past, I've gotten early access to House of the Dragon seasons 1 and 2, where I would get them a few days before release so I could very quickly try and make videos while staying up all night. This time, for Night of the Seven Kingdoms, HBO graciously gave me access to the entire season, and I figured I would put out a little pre-season review of the show here without spoilers, a thing I have never had the ability to do before, so thought it would be fun. This is going to be less of the scripted sort of polished content I've been known to put out in the past, more me just kind of talking from my notes which I have in front of me about what I thought, and then some Sean vids or Todd in the Shadows style visuals on the screen here so y'all have something to look at. It's not that I'm doing this quickly and want to get rolling on the other videos I have planned for the season. No, not that at all. With that in mind, let's get going. The adjectives I would use to describe the season are enjoyable, fun, charming, heartfelt, hopeful, and I would say bittersweet most of all. Words that are maybe a little foreign to the vocabulary of Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon. I think that's a pretty good place to start, the massive tone shift from those shows to this one. Just as an example, all the characters have personality and depth in a way that doesn't always happen in the other shows. There's no NPC style characters that show up and do one thing and then disappear. Background characters who like deliver information and then they're gone forever. If a character has lines in A Night of the Seven Kingdoms, they're memorable, they're unique, and they feel like real people. It's also very funny and lighthearted at times, sort of like you would see with Tyrion, Bronn, and Podrick, but if you made that kind of an entire TV show, and also very clearly drawing on Brienne and Podrick. I mean, there's a character that looks and acts so much like Podrick, I kind of did double take. The overall grimness and lingering sense of doom that overshadows the other two shows is also largely gone. It's very easy to forget while you're watching this that there is a wider Game of Thrones plot happening in the background. That's really in the background rather than the focus, which is very different for a show in Westeros. And not only that, but the seriousness of what we're dealing with is toned way down, along with the melodrama. You're focused on Dunk and his journey to make it as a knight and compete in this tournament, not like the looming invasion of the others or apocalyptic dragon war that threatens to wipe out everybody. There's also a lot of, I would call it slapstick humor, genuinely funny interactions where characters speak to each other like they aren't terrified of each other. Although it does come back a little bit when some royals show up, like Baelor and Maekar and Aerion kind of have that feel to them, much more Maekar and Aerion than Baelor. You really get to see this slice of life, sort of pastoral side of Westeros that exists when the most powerful characters in the world aren't right nearby. It really hammers that home that with the other two shows, the characters that we follow are, by and large, the most important people in the world and the most powerful ones too. And everybody around them knows it. They're all scared of them. And although we personally see their inner lives and private moments, these people are intimidating. These are the people that can ruin lives so easily, can kind of do whatever they want. And that changes every interaction they have. Everyone's very conciliatory. Everyone's very respectful of Ned Stark. Nobody's walking by telling him to go F himself, like happens to Dunk several times. Or to quote Raul Julia from the Street Fighter movie about how people treat these characters, "For you, the day Bison graced your village was the most important day of your life, but for me, it was Tuesday." And that kind of attitude pervades the other two shows. Not only that, but as I said, the stakes are so much lower for what's going on with the drama within every episode. You can actually relax as a viewer. The fate of the entire universe, the lives of every human on this continent do not hinge on what is happening. I mean, it kind of does in the long term, but those sort of plot threads are largely invisible for now, especially as we're focused on Dunk at 17 years old, trying to figure out what he's even doing with his life. And I mean, there is that kind of stuff. There is war in the background, there's high politics, reasons that this tourney are important, why it's happening, but those are important to Dunk, as his concerns are a lot more immediate, and that pervades the show. His problems are like, what am I going to eat tonight? Can he even enter the lists to joust? Did he make a fool of himself in front of a girl? These are everyday problems you can wrap your hands around, and it's a relief versus the overwhelming grimness and high stakes of those other two shows. There's that line from Game of Thrones where Tyrion says that these are problems too big for men to get their arms around, and Dunk and Egg is kind of like the response to that. These are all things you can relate to. I don't really think there's anyone out there that can really wrap their arms around emotionally what it would be like really facing down the others. What to get for food when you're low on money? That's the thing most people can probably relate to at some point in their life. You also feel like you can just sort of breathe as you watch the show, at least some of the time. They're using human connections to draw you in rather than just constantly ratcheting up the stakes to keep you on the edge of your seat. You're not on the edge of your seat. You're leaning back, having a great time watching this kind of silly little jaunt around a tournament. Second thing I want to talk about was kind of the humor. There's gags in this show. There's deliberate funny moments, and funny on purpose too, not mistakes they made that we're all laughing about, like, oh my god, they left a Starbucks cup. Like, there are crafted jokes that work. That's so weird to be in a Game of Thrones show. How long has it been since a character laughed in House of the Dragon and laughed at something funny that happened, not laughing at someone's misfortune or misery? Game of Thrones too, as the seasons went on, everything just got so much more serious, and the humor and silly moments they put in early into the show really just kind of faded away. For this show, I laughed all the time at it, and not at it, I laughed with it. I enjoyed the humor it was giving me. I think that there may be some fans that bounce off it in a weird way though, because it's very much a huge tonal shift for how you expect the universe to function and characters to behave. Like I said earlier, there's no stable hand that's going to tell Ned Stark to get bent. But that does happen here. That's a very different expectation for how interaction should go. And to address the thing that I am sure is going to come up a lot on social media after this goes live, there's a lot of sort of gross out body humor and slapstick humor. There's a running gag at the beginning of every episode that they are going to try and gross you out really hard, and they often succeeded. There's no gags in House of the Dragon. There's no running jokes in Game of Thrones except for Tyrion and the donkey and the honeycomb or whatever it was. A lot of that stuff had to be cut out because they were trying to go for economy of screen time. You know, these little small moments where characters are having fun with each other. I mean, you could put that on the screen, or you could show us something that moves the plot forward when you have limited time. I think the best example of this in House of the Dragon is Shirako Lohar, played by Abigail Thorne. Shirako is a ridiculous character who says over-the-top and outlandish things constantly, and then at one point starts mud wrestling Tywin Lannister to earn their respect, which was definitely a thing that happened in season 2. To be fair, a lot of fans did not really enjoy Shirako's antics and the subplot not because Abigail did a bad job. She was great as this pirate lord. It's because it was sandwiched between the extreme grimness and high stakes of the rest of the show. You might go from somebody getting burned alive to all of a sudden, haha, Tywin's covered in mud. And then all of a sudden you flash back and it's people plotting to murder their entire family. You know, it's jarring. It also creates this feeling that they could have used those minutes where Tywin and Shirako are rolling in the mud better to serve other plots to develop things people are more interested in. But as a character, that whole sequence would have fit much better in the Hedge Knight, where that kind of tone and narrative pressure to have every second count is drastically reduced. They can have fun. They can have stupid little jokes that pop up because they're not trying to cram in an entire book into a couple episodes. And I think they use this humor deliberately at the start of each episode to kind of do a tone-setting thing, to let you know that your expectations of what's about to come are going to be very different, that you should not expect the same kind of interactions and characters that you got from Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon. It's the same world, but the difference between the rich and the poor here is so drastic it may as well not be. And as to the gross out body humor, I know that, for example, if I tried to get my parents to watch episode 1, I don't think they would make it 5 minutes in. And I think that's a really big swing by the showrunners and writers to put that in there. They're definitely going to turn off people who are squeamish and people who don't find that stuff funny or aren't invested enough to keep watching through it. I get why they did it. I'm not sure it's a great idea. Although that whole concept is interesting because Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon feature much worse things in terms of over-the-top violence, abuse, torture, death, and etc., etc. And in this case, it's somebody doing something gross that might cause people to stop watching. I don't know what that says, but I find it interesting. Next up, sort of this reintroduction of introspection, I guess I'll call it. In the main series, non-book readers may not realize that the books are told from inside the heads of the main characters, where you can read their thoughts and inner desires that they do not vocalize. It's why characters like Jon Snow are so different in the show versus the book version. Jon's rich inner life, his snark and sarcasm, are things that he largely suppresses because of his background being a bastard in House Stark and Winterfell. He learned to be in the background. He learned to not get noticed. He learned to hold his tongue. So when that translates to the show and you can't hear those thoughts, you get the sort of ever-brooding Kit Harington version of Jon, while we're left to imagine what's going on in his head. Now, Book Jon does have that same brooding exterior and behavior, but you also get to read his thoughts that are behind it. So it creates a very different perception of who he is. The Hedge Knight is told in the same way. It's told from inside Dunk's head, so you can read his thoughts and perceptions of the world around him instead of just seeing his actions. And Game of Thrones decided not to include those vocalizations, probably because it would be really weird, especially what happens when two characters who have a POV interact with each other. Like Tyrion and Jon are both POV characters, we can both read their thoughts. If they're on screen at the same time and they're thinking things, which one gets heard on the screen? It kind of doesn't work. So what Knight of the Seven Kingdoms decided to do is they allowed Dunk to vocalize these things, but in a kind of a clever way. That instead of having Dunk standing around looking confusing, thinking hard, which is honestly what it looks like to others, they have him talk a lot. Although it's not to people, it's mostly to his horses, a thing that within the show is a joke that people think it's weird that he's talking to his horses. But that's how they got around it. That's how they're letting us hear Dunk's thoughts, by just having him walking around talking to Sweetfoot and Chestnut. If you compare it to his thoughts in The Hedge Knight, they're pretty much the same thing. Good job on that one. But not only that, we get a lot of flashbacks and memories from Dunk that are relevant and portrayed in a way that let us know that this is what he's thinking in the moment. And the editing here is really good. We're cutting back and forth between the past and present, images flashing on top of each other. You can see the effects on Dunk in real time as he's remembering these things. You may not have really recognized this, but this is a thing that never happens in the main series or House of the Dragon. Those stories are told almost exclusively in a linear fashion. One event after another, after another, after another. If a character remembers something in a moment, if they're thinking about something, we don't really know unless they are telling somebody else about it. They don't do flashbacks. The notable exception to this is Daemon's Weirwood Pace Dreams in season 2, where we get to see his dreams and hallucinations, but even then, those are happening to in the moment. He's not reliving his past in the same kind of way as Dunk is. Knight of the Seven Kingdoms really breaks this mold, and it's better for it not just story-wise, but also from a filmmaking perspective. In moments of stress, Dunk flashes back to these strong related memories, and cutting back and forth for this really cool dramatic effect. Other moments, which are played for laughs most of the time, Dunk will claim something happened or is true, and then in almost like an Arrested Development kind of way, the editing will contradict him, showing the truth behind those memories and what really happened. And it makes for a much more interesting show to watch filmmaking-wise. It allows for creativity that the visual style that the other shows employed really did not allow for. It also allows you to get to know Dunk much better than almost any other character in the other two shows, since he is speaking aloud all of his inner thoughts to the horses, instead of us relying on conversations and having to read facial tics and expressions and body language to try and guess at what's going on inside his head. Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon do this a little, notably the Starks kids sometimes would talk to their direwolves, and then sometimes with the dragons in House of the Dragon, but these are much more limited interactions and really went away, especially in Game of Thrones once the direwolves were budgetary cuts. This particular show is much richer for this notable break from the convention set down by Game of Thrones by going back the almost POV style that George wrote it in. Next up, fixing of issues and filling in blanks. Now, I love the Hedge Knight and the Mystery Knight and the Sworn Sword. These are wonderful pieces of writing by George that capture a real sense of the medieval slice of life that is really difficult to find in the rest of his stories. However, it's not hard to read the Hedge Knight and see that it is noticeably, lacking in some areas, largely brought on by the deadline George was working on to get it published in the anthology Legends. He talks about it in a recent podcast that he did with Jason Concepcion on the official Game of Thrones YouTube channel, that he submitted it the night before it was due, so he just kind of had to get it out the door. And what I'm really talking about here, what's missing is the history of Westeros, because he hadn't made it up yet, but also personal relationships between different characters. The Hedge Knight is actually pretty short. Not just in length, it's something like 60 to 80 pages, but it's also short on character introductions, backstories, personality, and these characters' roles in the story. There's quite a few characters that kind of show up and do their part, and then that's kind of it. Knight of the Seven Kingdoms has taken a big swing at improving these parts by drastically expanding character depth, scope, and notably their relationships. By far the biggest one here is Lionel Baratheon, who in the Hedge Knight shows up to take part in a major set piece near the end, says a few lines, and then that's kind of it. Here, Lionel has been recast as a major supporting character who Dunk and Egg meet and interact with throughout the season. The Laughing Storm looms large in this story, and in particular his relationship to Dunk, which has gone from passing acquaintances to something very much closer. Lionel is hilarious, he's unpredictable, he's a delight every time he's on screen, and absolutely none of that is in the Hedge Knight. I know it probably better than most from my YouTube channel, but we're in a media environment where the idea of faithfulness is a word that is thrown about liberally by some as their most important criteria for adaptation. They want, more than anything, for the adaptation to be exactly like the source material. No changes. The more changes, the worse it is. And that makes this kind of a tricky top. The Hedge Knight has been changed drastically in coming into the world of television. A large amount of the season is a lot like the example of Lionel, an expansion of existing content in a way that makes sense and improves the show as well as keeping the soul of the story, but the expense is being it's not literally the same as the words on the page, and in some cases made up whole cloth. Now, I personally enjoyed and appreciated the care that was done in adding to the Hedge Knight. I loved this TV show, probably more than I love the source novella at this point. I can, however, certainly appreciate that not everyone will, that your experience as a quote-unquote hardcore fan may be jarring in just how much it's changed from the original novella. And I'm not talking about aesthetic things that I see people talking about, like, oh no, Arianne's hair is shorter, or Lionel isn't this hulking beast like he is in the Hedge Knight. It's a lot more pervasive. I really appreciate the original work done here because although it is very different from the little words on the page, it still felt to me like it is the same story, the same soul, the same tone and bittersweetness that made me love the Hedge Knight the first time I read it. It's the kind of thing where I can easily imagine if George wanted to revise the Hedge Knight and expand it, add in the details and history he had written since that this show is probably a lot what it would look like. So that's my warning here. There's a lot different, but it's good. Think the Tywin Arya scene from Game of Thrones when they meet each other at Harrenhal, a thing that is not in the books, but over time has stood up as one of the best additions to the source material that Dan and Dave came up with. Like that, except it's a third of the season. I touched on this earlier and I want to go back to the filmmaking a little bit. To me, A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms is a great example of great directing, editing, and creativity we have seen from Game of Thrones property in quite a long time. I mentioned before the use of flashbacks and memories as a way that gets you inside Dunk's thick as a castle wall head. Ira Parker and his team have done a great job in making this feel totally different. A lot of Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon are very static and formulaic in how the episodes and seasons run. Most scenes are just two characters in a room talking to each other, shot, reverse shot, back to the principal, and then we teleport somewhere else and we see the same interaction done over and over again, with the formula being broken up by occasional battles or some cool amount of CGI. A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms is far more experimental in how they're portraying their story, especially in scenes like the joust where the camera is inside Dunk's helmet, allowing you to hear and see what he would be experiencing firsthand. And it's tough to describe exactly what I'm talking about without using spoilers. I think when you watch it, you'll understand it better. It's a show that through the directing and editing is making its own new visual style rather than just imitating Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon, and it's so much better for it. Part of this is budgetary, of course. This show does not have the money for a giant CGI dragon, nor a fully built Red Keep like House of the Dragon has. It's essentially set in a moderately sized Ren Fair. There's only a few locations. I don't think there's any CGI. If there is, I'm not really sure where it would be. This makes the production have to try a lot harder to be more creative about drawing you in, knowing that they don't have these sort of crutches and the same buttons to push to keep you interested. And that's reflected in how they use these different techniques to make the show visually pop and unique from the others. And this extends as well to the music. The use of music in the show has drastically changed. We all love the orchestral masterpieces in Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon. The music in those properties kind of tends to get a bit samey. A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms has gone much more for music that sounds like folk music or like shanties, and sometimes songs that are anachronistic to the setting itself. By that I mean music that isn't intended to sound like it's being made within the universe, but instead tracks that enhance the experience for you alone. Like for instance, there's a very quiet moment with a wide shot and the music comes forward as less background and more a character in what we're seeing. In the scene, Dunk and Egg are relaxing underneath an elm tree, and this folksy tune with whistling creates this powerful, memorable moment that you don't really get from Game of Thrones of House of the Dragon, where during high emotional moments, they would run the character's theme underneath the scene, almost like it's their name tag or their catchphrase in music terms. That kind of filmmaking is very different from the other two properties and something I greatly appreciated and I didn't know I needed changed. You sort of get used to how these shows function, how they look, how the scenes interact, how they flow, how the episodes are set up, even how it sounds. And very quickly, at least for me, hopefully the same will happen for you, you'll realize that these techniques are being used a breath of fresh air within the properties. My last topic here would be the acting. The acting is phenomenal across the board. Peter Claffey is the most dunk that has ever dunked a dunk. And kind of in the same way that Charles Dance has replaced Tywin in my head when I read the books, Peter is dunk in my head now. I cannot go back and read those books without hearing his voice and seeing his face. There's a real vulnerability in his performance and how he nails that while Dunk is this giant of a man that is constantly marked on for his size and strength, emotionally Dunk is still a boy at heart, a lost boy who is struggling mightily with loss and how to live without direction of Sir Arlen. The subtle ways that Dunk grows in confidence over these 6 episodes, finds courage in himself he didn't know he had, and learns to express himself is expertly portrayed. There's so many small moments and subtle facial expressions as well as hesitations that make you forget this is a performance and not a real person. And Peter himself has great comedic timing and sort of knows how to play very well to the camera. A lot of the humor comes from his reaction to things. And the same is true for the rest of the main cast, although there's kind of only the 2 of them. Egg is portrayed by Dexter Sol Ansel, and he plays off Peter exceptionally well. There's obvious chemistry between these two that doesn't feel forced, it feels genuine. The part of Egg that Dexter gets the most right is the feeling that Egg is this conflicted young boy who is struggling to find his own identity. You know, on one hand, he's incredibly quick, knowledgeable, intelligent, that knows everything Dunk does not, and he knows it too. But on the other hand, Dexter plays Egg as a lonely figure who suffers from emotional neglect and abuse, with really no friends and a life that he's trying to escape from. That's the part of Egg that rings the truest, how he looks at this Hedge Knight who is thick as a castle wall, wearing a rope belt, and finds something admirable in him that is unexpected to Egg. He sees freedom in Dunk, and more than that, a simple earnestness and honor that Egg really wants to emulate, and you see him growing towards throughout the season. The change of character from beginning to end is wonderful. Dexter showing how Egg was not just this annoying little know-it-all squire, but just like Dunk when he was a child. You know, he's a lost boy looking for kindness and really for people to care about him. Can see his shell cracking throughout the season, and the show is richer for it. Little Egg joke there for you. Among the other performances, Lionel Baratheon is the obvious one that stands out. Daniel Ings takes over every scene he is in as the Laughing Storm, a wild Stormlander as ever-changing as the thunderstorms that boom across his homelands, and also a character who feels kind of lost despite his exuberance. There's a kinship he finds with Dunk that I find very charming, that although their backgrounds could not be more different, with Lionel the heir to an entire kingdom, they share this common feeling of being unsure what they're doing with their lives. He plays the madman, the Laughing Storm, but these are really masks for Lionel searching for meaning and, more importantly, camaraderie that has eluded him in all his years sitting at court. Lionel in the Hedge Knight is a character that exists largely as scenery, an odd knight that embarrasses his foes and laughs at everything for reasons we don't really understand. Daniel Ings and the writers, though, have made that character have much more depth. It was a delight every time that Lionel boomed his way into a scene, especially his relationship to Dunk that in the book is basically non-existent, while in the show feels like a core draw of it. I will say there were very few performances that I felt were out of place or bad or just not up to the rest. Even minor characters with few lines made impressions, and all of them felt full of personality and life. The main one, though, that myself and I'm guessing fans may think wasn't the best is Sam Spruill as Maekar Targaryen. Now, I think this may be a directing issue rather than acting. However, Maekar is meant to be sort of this gruff, hard man, a military man who is intimidating and hard to get to know. But the way Maekar is portrayed in this show, he comes off as entitled and whiny in a way that feels out of place for a character of his standing and his age. It kind of feels like they wanted to add in a link between Maekar and Aerion to make Maekar act more like his son in order to explain where that behavior is coming from. But it came off very strange and grating. In fairness to the performance, Maekar is not meant to be a likable character within the Hedge Knight, and there's sort of this cold aloofness of nobility, but that's very different from the perpetually annoyed and confused prince that we get in A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms. Several times his behavior is explained by his brother Baelor. There's just something that's off about it. In a way, this is almost the inverse of the example I used earlier with Shirako Lohar, in that Maekar is played like a Game of Thrones character and Shirako is played like a Knight of the Seven Kingdoms character. If they just kind of swap places, it would make a lot more sense. That's really my only complaint, though. It's not that the character or acting are bad, it's just so different from what I was expecting, and in a way that clashed with the rest of the tone of the show. There's really no misses in this casting. Everyone was fantastic and felt real and alive, like you could walk into Ashford Meadow tomorrow and they'd all be there still getting ready for their tourney. So in summary, I'd say this with a great deal of love for the other two shows. A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms is my favorite season of Westerosi television that HBO has ever produced, which is, again, not to say it doesn't have its faults. It's not perfect. There are some spoilery things that left me a bit confused, and I'm not really sure about them, but, those will be topics for future videos, probably after the season. I will say I have never ended a season of Game of Thrones or House of the Dragon with as big of a smile on my face as I had when I finished this. It is fun, it is tragic, it is the soul of the mood George tries to hit so often with his works. It's not just bitter, there's the sweetness to it as well. It's a show that I already have rewatched multiple times, and I probably will again in the future, a thing I can't really say about every season of House of the Dragon or Game of Thrones. Word is they're already filming season 2, and I can't imagine they won't get a green light on a third season once this hits the airwaves. It is so good. I guess one thing I am kind of worried about is they say they want to go beyond the published works and go into the Village Hero or the She-Wolves of Winterfell. I am unsure about that decision because I would rather have the source material first for them to work off of and then do their magic with. We all know the dance of waiting for George to publish things. One thing I will say about the show is that the episodes are rather short, about a half hour each, and there's only 6 of them. My experience was binging them back to back. I'm unsure how it's going to play out, spread out over a month and a half for fans. It may be better to wait until it all comes out so you can binge the entire thing at once in like a 3-hour-ish marathon. However you choose to watch it though, I highly recommend you give it a chance. I would say this is my first 10 out of 10 season out of Game of Thrones or House of the Dragon. It really is that good. It's a vibe that Game of Thrones tried to hit with Arya and Sandor and then Brienne and Podrick, but I would say absolutely perfected here. You should watch it. Don't wait. Watch it as soon as it goes live. Anyway, thanks for listening and bye for now.